So, as I mentioned, the purpose of this session is to introduce CCL, introduce you to CCL, talk about our legislative proposal, and also talk about our methodology. And then we'll be talking about how to build political will for a sustainable climate by enabling you to have breakthroughs in your exercise of personal and political power. These are the two missions of CCL: to build the political will for a livable world and to enable you to have breakthroughs in your exercise of personal and political power. And then also teach our approach to having meetings with members of Congress, some of which you saw in the film this morning, and the transformation that Bradley Whitford went through from being just an angry constituent to being somebody who can have constructive conversations with their members of Congress. So the first session is on introducing CCL, our legislative proposal, creating political will, and our methodology. And first I want to talk about the founder of Citizens Climate Lobby, a man named Marshall Saunders. And if you're around Citizens Climate Lobby for any amount of time, I'm sure that you'll meet Marshall. He comes to as many of our conferences as he can. So Marshall's a businessman, and like all of us, he has something that inspires him on climate. Marshall's story was actually that he was a real estate agent in Southern California, and when he first began building his career, he got involved with Rotary International. And at Rotary, they encourage you to go off and do something and make a difference in the world. And he wrote, as part of that, when he joined Rotary, people encouraged him to write a sort of personal mission statement that would help motivate him on a daily basis to go off and do something beyond just running a business. And so he wrote a personal mission statement, and he keeps it on his full-length mirror in his bedroom, and he looks at it every day. And I'm sorry I don't have it here with me, but it inspired him to, again, look beyond himself and look beyond his business interests and his job. And over time, he got involved with an organization called Results. And Results is an anti-poverty organization, and they do much like CCL does. And in fact, we adopted the Results methodology when CCL was founded. They go and lobby Congress. They work with the media. They meet with their members of Congress. They do outreach at the grassroots level, and they try to build political support for legislation to address poverty. And so Marshall was already familiar with this methodology as he was doing his career. Eventually he retired from real estate, and he began to, because of his interest in poverty, he began to do microcredit loan origination. And so he started working in third world countries to get microcredit loans, $50, $25, $75, something like that, out to very poor families so that they could buy a sewing machine, buy a cow or a goat, and begin to build their own personal sort of mom and pop business, providing services to local communities, and by doing that then being able to pay back those loans. Back when Al Gore's movie came out, he was doing his microcredit business, and Al Gore's movie, somebody remind me what it was called? Inconvenient Truth, right. So the movie came out, and Marshall went to see it one night. And he was so moved by that message in that movie that he went back another 4 times in that same week to see the movie again. And what struck him was that all of this work that he was doing on poverty and microcredit loans was going to be wiped away by rising sea levels, basically, and by the storms and extreme precipitation and other things. And so he thought, if I really want to help these people, I ought not to just do microcredit loans, I ought to go and do something about climate change. So he, in his movie, Al Gore talks about people becoming climate presenters, and so Marshall went and did the training to be a climate presenter for Al Gore. And this is kind of what Marshall does, right? When he gets something into his head, he just goes and he does it. And so he went off and became a climate presenter, and then he started giving these presentations. And one night, after doing about 30 presentations, one night he goes back to his hotel room, and there's a news story on about how Congress has just provided the fossil fuel industry with another $10 billion in tax subsidies. And Marshall thinks, gee, what did I do tonight? I talked to about 30 people, and maybe I got all of them to change one light bulb. How are we ever going to turn the tide? How many more light bulbs do I need to have people change before we can even undo the $10 billion that the fossil fuel companies were just given? And what he realized was, you know what, we need an organization like Results that's going to work on climate change. And that was the origin. Marshall then, probably within months, held his first group start training, as it was called, or climate advocate training, with a small group of people in San Diego, and that was the first chapter, and then he's just built it up from there. So one of the things that CCL does is we always say, we are for, not against. So we're not in the business of creating conflict. We're not in the business of tearing people down. We're in the business of building people up and providing solutions. We're not just going to tell you about all the bad things that will come from climate change. We're here to also talk about a solution to climate change. And our solution is actually very simple. It's called Revenue Neutral Carbon Fee and Dividend. And this is a program whereby we put a fee on fossil fuels at the point of origin, whether it's a well, a mine, or a port of entry. And we gradually increase that fee over time. Obviously, by putting a fee on something, that's going to drive up downstream costs. So the price of fossil fuel energy is going to go up, which is a good thing, because as we saw in 2008, when gas went to $4 a gallon, people changed their habits. Okay, so there's an obvious relationship between, price and use, and we ought to take advantage of that. One of the key innovations in our policy is that it is revenue neutral, and what we mean by that is all of the revenue raised by the fee is returned to households. And it's not returned to households on any demographic or market basis. It's returned equally to all households. So every household, from the least energy intensive household to the highest intensity energy household, all get the same check back. So we think that a predictably rising fee on fossil fuels will drive economic behavior, that market-driven approach that was talked about in the movie. And by giving people back the money, that will give households the opportunity to make their own decisions about what they need to do on an energy basis, and products and services, in order to get themselves by. Now we commissioned, CCL commissioned a study to find out what would the economic effects of this policy be. Because a lot of people will say if you tax energy, you're going to kill the economy. So we had one of the premier economic modeling firms in the country do a study of this policy. And I'm just going to quickly read off some of the things they found. First of all, CO2 emissions would decline by 50% over 20 years, relative to what would occur otherwise. National employment would increase by 2.8 million over 20 years. Again, above and beyond any natural economic growth that would have happened. 250,000 lives would, 250,000 premature deaths would be avoided over that 20-year period. GDP would increase, annual GDP would increase by $70 to $80 billion per year over 20 years. This is really interesting. The size of a monthly dividend for a family of 4 with 2 adults in 20 years would be $400 per month. So annually, that's $3,400 per family of 4. I'm sorry, that's in 2025.
What would be the price of the fee?
So the fee at that point would be about $2. Sorry, it would be about $200 per ton of CO2.
So where is it at $15?
Where is it at? Oh, $15. So $15 is the first year. $15 per ton in the first year. Oh, and what would the dividend be? I think it's something like $50 a month or something like that. Electricity prices would peak in 2026 and then start to decrease. Real incomes would rise. The maximum cost of living increase cumulative over the 20-year period would only be in the range of about 2%. So overall, it doesn't even introduce all that much inflation into the economy. Electricity from coal would be phased out by 2025. And then really interestingly, the regional gross products, so if you break the United States up into 9 separate regions, 8 out of 9 of those regions would actually benefit, would have greater regional gross product than they will otherwise. So again, growth pretty much across the board. And in the 9th region, which is really that fossil fuel intensive region down in the Gulf, they would still have growth. Their growth just wouldn't be as much as if we go on with a business as usual. So we have a really great story to tell, and now the question is, how are we going to get that story out? And so, as I mentioned, we follow this thing called the results methodology, which is the methodology really developed by results in a kind of incremental way as they found need over their history, because they didn't just walk into some methodology; they had to invent it as they went. So our methodology has 5 different levers. One of them is direct lobbying, like you saw in the movie. Another is working through local media, through meeting with editorial boards, writing letters to the editor, and doing op-eds. The third is grass tops endorsements, so trying to get into conversations with influential individuals and getting them to endorse our policy. Grassroots outreach by arranging showings of movies and engaging your communities, church communities or other social justice communities that you're a part of, Rotary and so on, to get our message out. And also group and volunteer development. So I don't have a lot of time to go into all of these, but one of the things that we do, and that's a constant, is lobbying. And in fact, lobbying really informs everything that we do. So when you learn our lobbying approach, you don't just apply that with members of Congress, you apply that with your editorial board, you apply that with your influential individuals. It's really all the same process because you face all of the same obstacles in conversations with bringing new people to this. The warming. Our carbon fee and dividend proposal works like this. A fee is placed on fossil fuels at the source, the well, mine, port of entry. This fee starts at $15 per ton of CO2 equivalent emissions and increases steadily each year by $10. 100% of the net fees are returned to American households on an equal basis. Under this plan, about 2/3 of all households would break even or receive more in their dividend checks than they would pay in higher prices due to the fee, thereby protecting the middle class and lower income households. A border tariff adjustment is placed on goods imported from or exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. This adjustment would both discourage businesses from relocating to where they can emit more CO2 and encourage other nations to adopt an equivalent price on carbon. A predictably increasing carbon price will send a clear market signal, which will unleash entrepreneurs and investors in the new clean energy economy. So then, turn the sheet over and have your partner ask, so what is the policy that you are proposing? And then repeat something back. I want to, because I see a few smirks and a little hesitancy, what did I get myself into? And I just want to mention that I've had, so I've had this kind of running experience with Citizens Climate Lobby from my very first national conference, which, by the way, the reason I ever went to my first national conference was because Marshall Saunders called me up and asked me to go, which I really have to thank him for. That there's a big emphasis on these lobby meetings and preparing for these lobby meetings. And I want to disabuse you of the notion that any of this is high stakes, okay? There's no pressure here. I would say that, you know, whether you're able to memorize these, which I don't encourage you to do, but pick out the key facts that speak most clearly to you. And those are the things that you want to say back. When we're prepared and we speak from the heart, that's when we have the biggest impact. So don't make this a high stakes, high tension exercise. Just take it for what it is, which is an opportunity to learn something and practice and get better at it as you go along.
Sorry.
So we have a couple of minutes, and so what questions or reflections do you have on the exercise or on the material for this, what I've talked about so far?
We had a question about if, let's say you're not on the grid at all, you get the check anyway.
And so
How do they find you if they can send you your check?
And so the question is, if you're not on the grid at all, do you still get the check anyway, and how do they find you so they can send you your check? Well, people who will get the check are people who have valid either Social Security or tax ID numbers, right? So the government has done this in the past. They've sent us all checks, right, with you know, stimulus checks and so on. And so we know that the government's perfectly capable of doing this. And as long as you're not, you know, trying to hide all your income and trying to, you know, you're just participating in the black market, and you're not known to the U.S. government, then you won't get a check. But legal residents and so on. Yeah, well, and if you're off the grid, then obviously you're not affected at all by the rising cost of energy, and so you just get the check. Okay, back there.
What agency is responsible for handling this and distributing the fee?
I think this would be Treasury. So they would get the funds and hold them in an account and then distribute the check. So the question is, what agency would be responsible for this? And I believe it's Treasury.
Would that include the IRS?
I'm not sure about the specific mechanics of that and to what degree the IRS would be involved. Right. Okay. Over here, behind you, I think. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Back to the question about who receives the checks and how. Like if you are a renter, or if you are, say, you don't have a home, you know, do you still get a check as long as you're known to the government, or is it households, meaning
Right.
residents?
Okay. So the question is, if you're a renter, then do you still get a check, or is it only households, people who own homes, I guess? And the answer is, as long as you have a valid Social Security or tax ID number, which would be everybody, then you get the check whether you're a renter or a homeowner or whatever your status is, or homeless for that matter, right? As long as you're known to the IRS and the Treasury Department, you would still get a check. Back there?
Yes, how do you respond to people who say anything that the government is involved in is a problem and I will never see my check because it will be used for something else?
Right. So the question is, how can we trust the government to actually return the money? And, you know, interestingly enough, that was a question that we got from a Democratic senator one time. He said, you know, in Washington, we all have sticky fingers. And once we see this money coming in, it's going to be very hard for us to let go of it. And the answer is basically, Citizens Climate Lobby is not going to disband after passage of this legislation. In fact, it's very unlikely that this legislation will be passed in the form that we propose it in which case it's either going to be better, well, we could hope, or worse than what we're proposing. And then the next year, we will still go back to Washington and we will lobby for whatever the next most logical thing is. So if, for example, a bill gets passed and it's not revenue neutral at all, then we will be back saying, look, you've got to do something about the disparities that are introduced by the bill that you just passed. And we will try to make it be revenue neutral. If it looks like the money is not going back to households and then instead it's being used to fund other efforts, we will draw attention to that and we will be lobbying our representatives and senators to fix that.
So they will say that they are paying higher costs, but that to get their money back, they must rely on our lobbying efforts. Is that correct?
We have to continue to fight for something that's fair, simple, and transparent.
Okay.
And we would just continue doing that. Over here?
That term revenue neutral, it's
Yeah.
not like a common term. So what do you mean by revenue neutral?
What-
It would be nice for this to be common everyday language.
Yes. So the question is, what do you mean by revenue neutral? It's not a common everyday term, so people might not understand it. And what we mean by revenue neutral is that it does not cost the government anything in order to implement this proposal.
Okay, but why not just say that?
Well, so the question is, why not just say that? And that's why I said, when you practice the laser talk, you don't have to use our language, right? You can use language that comes naturally to you. And it may well be that you discover a better way of saying it that is easier to convey, that people just naturally resonate to, and that's a good thing, right? I have to say, in my time in CCL, my language has evolved from being, strictly speaking, what CCL is proposing at any given time, to, again, what feels most naturally to me, and what I feel is going to be most effective in conveying my message to the audience. So it's something, we are not dictating that you have to use exactly our language at any point in the conversation. It's really about...
Just use plain, ordinary language.
No, right, and what I'm suggesting is you're free to do that when you get into your meetings. And I do it to the best of my personal ability, right? Because that's all I have to draw on. Okay, we'll take one more question and then we have to move on.
I almost hear screaming inside my head. Redistribution! Redistribution! What do you do about it?
Of wealth.
Right, exactly.
So the question is, this is obviously a redistributive policy that is going to, you could say, disproportionately benefit the poor. But on the other hand, it's true that the poor are the people who have least contributed to the problem of climate change. And they are the people who will be most impacted by the problem of climate change. And so basically what's happening today is a redistribution of wealth as well, from the poor to the rich. And so this policy proposal does nothing more or less than simply level the playing field.
But I'm mainly interested in the politics of that. We just had a $1 trillion tax bill passed. It does just cements in, take from the poor and give to the rich. I mean, I'm sorry to sound political, but there's a huge political implication of this based on what we see going on around us all the time.
So the statement is that there's a huge political,
The implications are
there's
basically...
huge political implications to the policy that we're proposing. And
No, there's it's like buzzwords going off in the heads of the people you're trying to convince.
yes,
They see wealth redistribution.
right.
Their idea of wealth redistribution, some of them, is take from the poor and give to the rich because the rich know what they're doing with it and they'll create jobs.
Yeah.
Right? We just did that. So we're up against something that is really heavily, if anything, going in the opposite direction.
Yeah, we are up against something that is really heavily going in the opposite direction, and that's been true. That is true at almost every point in our fight. And so we're going to get to how you deal with that personally, not necessarily that specific question, but how you deal with that on a personal basis and keep going.
Is it that heavy a redistribution? Is it as extreme as?
Okay, so we really have to move on. Is it really heavily, I mean, the lower 60% of households benefit from this. They either break even or they come out ahead, right? I don't know, you know, in the upper 40%, they either break even or they come out behind. Now, is that heavily redistributed?
But the actual dollar values compared to the new tax bill are probably substantially less.
Well, in 20 years, we're going to be collecting over $1 trillion annually in revenue from this policy. So that is the.
There'll be more to redistribute.
But there's choice involved. It's not straight redistribution because there's choice involved. If I have a yacht and I don't like this
Sure.
extra money on me, and I can decide I'm not going to use my yacht so much.
Yes, you
The
can
point
choose.
of it is incentivizing people to use their card.
Well, and incentivizing businesses to build solutions. So I can run a yacht as long as it's battery powered, and I and uses solar grids to charge the batteries. Okay, we really, yeah, and that too, right? The ultimate form of solar power. Okay, so we need to move on to the next section. So we'll start the clock now. And this section is titled CCL is for and not against, and enabling breakthroughs, and a concept called power versus force. So as I mentioned, CCL's dual policy mission is to create the political will out in the world, in the Congress, and in our districts for a sustainable climate. And we're going to do that by enabling you all to have breakthroughs in your exercise of personal and political power. I mentioned that we have these 5 levers that we work with: lobbying and grass tops and grassroots and so on. And in order to be effective in those things, it's going to be necessary for you to get outside of your comfort zone. You know, you can judge my ability as a public speaker through my leading this exercise here. But when I joined CCL, I had, probably like many people, a real fear of public speaking. I can remember times when I was in situations, room full of strangers, and I knew that I was going to be called on to make comments about something that I was proposing. And when it came time for that comment phase, I made sure that I was the first person to stand up or to put my hand up, because I didn't want to sit through everybody else's stellar presentations and be comparing myself to them, and just becoming more and more panicked. And so, you know, CCL has really been transformative for me in that way, and it required me to get outside of my comfort zone. So I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, in terms of you know, having those types of breakthroughs in your exercise of personal and political power. But first I want to talk about something that's really important in our work, and that can help with your being able to continue this and have the courage to get outside your comfort zone. And that is our philosophy that CCL is for and not against. So the second Saturday of every month, we have a national conference call, which is split up into 3 parts. First, there is an educational piece where we get a nationally recognized speaker, and then we do reports from the field where we gain inspiration, and then we do what are the recommended actions for the coming month. But one time we had a speaker on named Rob Willer, and he teaches at UC Berkeley, and he wrote a book called Apocalypse Soon: Dire Messages Reduce Belief in Global Warming by Contradicting Just World Beliefs. And what Rob Willer told us is that if all you do is go out and talk about all of the bad things that are going to happen from climate change, then people are going to have this attitude that there must be something wrong with your understanding, because how could we as a society have screwed up something so big as this, right? On the other hand, if you talk somewhat about what some of the implications are going to be, but then also offer a solution, then people will say, wow, you really know your science. And it's that other part about offering a solution that gives people the capacity to say, oh, maybe there is a way out of this problem, and maybe it's not just all doom and gloom. Maybe there is some benefit or some optimism. So, so we pride ourselves as being an organization that is for and not against, in that very explicit way of always offering a solution and always talking about the solution and being optimistic about the solution. But also, rather than talk about all of the remote possibilities of doom and gloom and disasters, climate disasters, extreme precipitation, and all the rest, making our experience of climate change very personal. And this is kind of summed up in a quote by E.B. White, which we call Save versus Savor. And E.B. White said, "Every morning I awake torn between a desire to save the world and an inclination to savor it. This makes it hard to plan the day." But if we forget to savor the world, what possible reason do we have for saving it? In a way, savoring must come first. And so I want to tell you a story. It's about myself and a little bit about my personal save versus savor experience. And so when I was young, I grew up in Billerica, Massachusetts. It's a town a little bit northwest of Boston. And we grew up in a three-family farmhouse. And in fact, we were the first family to own this house after it had been converted from a working farm. It was a three-story house. It had bedrooms on the second and third floors. And as you can imagine, that third floor could get kind of warm during the day because there was no attic to protect it from the daytime heat. And but the interesting thing about living in that house was that even on a hot summer day, when we went to bed at night, if we left the windows open, things would cool down. And I learned as I was growing up, because my father was an iron worker, he had to work outside. And so his job and whether he was going to go to work or not was very dependent on what the weather was going to be like. And so every night he would watch, he probably would watch 3 different weathermen every night just to make sure that he knew what the story was going to be for tomorrow and whether he was going to be going to work or not. And because I was young and because he was my father and because I saw how concerned he was about the weather, I used to watch the weather with him and pay attention to it. And I remember the weatherman of the day talking about something called radiational cooling. And what radiational cooling is that during the day the earth warms up. I mean, the actual soil, the ground, the buildings, the trees, everything warms up during the day when the sun is out. But at night, if there's nothing to hold that heat in, that heat is just going to radiate out through the atmosphere. Now, if it's cloudy and if there's a lot of moisture in the air, water is a very potent greenhouse gas, and so it's going to tend to kind of hold that in. But at night, if it's a cloudless night and it's the middle of the summer, it's going to cool off pretty rapidly. And so I remember them talking about radiational cooling. So I was probably 10 or 11 years old and watching the weather and hearing this phrase. So you could get these dramatic temperature swings between daytime highs and nighttime lows. So one of the things that happens when we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere is that the difference between those daytime highs and nighttime lows compresses. And in fact, what happens is the nighttime lows tend to creep up because it's harder for the heat to get out of the atmosphere. And so now what I find is that I'm glad I'm not living on the third story of a farmhouse in Billerica, is that if we keep our windows open, and at my house we don't have built-in air conditioning. We don't have a lot of air conditioners in the window. We depend on the nighttime cooling to make it comfortable for us to sleep. And what I notice is that we just don't get that same kind of cooling going on. And I don't experience the waking up in the middle of the night wanting to close the window because it's too cold out. So this may not sound like a big deal to a lot of people. A lot of people might think, well, you've always got the air conditioner. You could shut your windows and turn the air conditioner on. But you know, I like the luxury of being able to sleep with the windows open and feel that old-fashioned radiational cooling kicking in, but it's not there anymore. And I've heard this from other people as well. So you can't always tie things to climate change, but I'm imagining that there are things in your life, personal experiences that you've had, where you say, this just isn't the way that it used to be, and I miss the way it used to be. And that's a much more powerful message to be giving to somebody if they don't believe in climate change than to be talking about sea level rise and extreme precipitation and flooding and coastal erosion and stuff like that that is distant both in time and space and isn't going to be as impactful. But when you tell a personal story, it is. A second thing I want to get to is how we're not going to do this by being the people who come in and pound on the table and take an adversarial approach to the people who are not willing to do pass our policy. And so I want to tell you a story that kind of crystallizes this, and it comes from Mark Reynolds and Marshall Saunders. When Marshall Saunders first hired Mark Reynolds to be the executive director of Citizens Climate Lobby, Marshall made a comment to Mark and said, do you think we can use Gandhi as a model for the work that we're going to do? Not because he was an inspiring and important historical figure, but because I think we're up against something like ending slavery. I think we're up against something like getting women to vote. And this is probably as monumental a thing as either of those efforts. And so the story I think that sums up a little bit of what Marshall was getting at was this one. Before the start of the 20th century, there were about 62,000 Indians living in South Africa, including the British colonies of Natal and the Cape, and the borough republics of Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And most of the Indians were indentured laborers or newly freed laborers. And in August of 1906, the Asiatic Law Amendment Ordinance was passed in the Transvaal. It was a humiliating and discriminating law forcing Indians in the Transvaal to register with the Registrar of Asiatics, submit to physical examinations, provide fingerprints, and carry a registration certificate at all times. And they could be fined, imprisoned, or deported. And this became known as the Black Act. And Gandhi turned his attention to the Black Act and overturning it. And so the first thing he did was he asked for a meeting with the head of the South African Army, a man named Field Marshal Jan Christian Smuts. Now, Smuts is a big man. He's over 6 feet tall, and he was in full military uniform when Gandhi walked in to meet with him. And Gandhi walks in wearing this thing called a dhoti, which looks like a big diaper, but that's how he was dressed. And so Gandhi walks up to this man, over 6 foot tall man in full military uniform, and he says, I am here to tell you that I oppose your government. Really, says Smuts. Anything else I should know? Yes, says Gandhi, I intend to prevail. And General Smuts then asks, really, how do you intend to do that? And Gandhi replies, with your help. And so this is really the approach that we try to take with the people who haven't been included in this discussion about climate change so far. We want to know from them, how can they be a part of helping us solve the problem? It turned out that Smuts and Gandhi actually developed a very close relationship in a sense. I don't know if you could say that they were friends, but they grew to have a strong sense of mutual respect for each other. And Gandhi used to weave slippers And at one point, he presented Smuts with a pair of slippers that he had woven. And Smuts wore those slippers till the end of his life. So, so I'm not saying that you have to do that for all of the people who might oppose us in Congress, but you know, that's just an example, something to strive for. So I want to do an exercise in a second that is about power versus force. And because I think that story of Gandhi really illustrates the difference between power and force. And in introducing this, I want to read a quote from Charles Wright, who wrote a book called Power and the Law, about force and power. So Charles Wright said in Power and the Law, "Power means to me pretty much the same thing as freedom. Power is the thing everybody wants the most that they can possibly have of. That is, skiing is power, sex is power, the ability to make yourself heard by your congressperson is power. Anything that comes out of you and goes into the world is power. And in addition to that, the ability to be open, to appreciate, to receive love, to respond to others, to listen to music, to understand literature. All of that is power. By power, I mean the human faculties exercised to the largest possible degree. So in a way, in a large sense, by power, I mean individual intelligence. Now when you reach out to another person through the energy or creativity which is in you, and the other person responds, you are exercising power. When you make somebody else do something against their will, to me that is not power at all, that is force. And force to me is the negation of power. I want to just repeat that last part. When you reach out to another person through the energy or creativity which is in you, and the other person responds, you are exercising power. When you make somebody else do something against their will, to me that is not power at all, that is force. And force to me is a negation of power. So as I said, we're not going to be the people banging on the table and trying to force members of Congress to do something that's against their will. We want to use our personal power to bring them along to positions where they can do what's needed in order to guarantee a sustainable climate. Any questions or reflections on the exercise?
Repeat the question.
The question is, the story that I talked about for myself was more personal and emotional. Yeah, but the laser talk was very policy oriented and neutral. And so when you go into a meeting, what's the balance that you should strike? What you're going to find when you go into a lobby meeting particularly is that there isn't a lot of opportunity to spend sharing personal stories. And so there you're going to be more focused on the aide or the member of Congress that you're talking to and maybe trying to get them to elicit from them their personal stories. But if everybody went in and shared their personal story, the meeting would be over and you wouldn't have gotten to your ask. On the other hand, when you go out and do grassroots or grass tops outreach, or when you're writing a letter to the editor, or when you're writing an op-ed, those are ideal times for sharing personal stories because there'll be less time pressure, and you're seeking to make those personal, you're looking to really connect on a personal level with somebody in order to get them to take a leap to come over to our position, and maybe get them to recognize that they have their own personal experience about climate change. So there's never one answer to what you do. It always comes down to circumstance and how you might be feeling. Okay, so the next part, the culminating part of the training, is actually going to result in your preparing for your first meeting with a member of Congress, and then holding a mock meeting with some seasoned volunteers who are going to come in and act as members of Congress for your meeting. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the one very important approach, one very important philosophy that we have whenever we hold a meeting with a member of Congress or their staff, or for that matter, any of the other people that I've talked about. Faith communities, other communities that you're in touch with, grass tops, grassroots, editorial boards, journalists. And that is that CCL always walks into every meeting that we have with whoever it is with an attitude of respect, appreciation, and gratitude. It's not easy being a politician in today's environment. And so the last thing they want is to be attacked in their own office by a group that's irate and that is making demands on them. And again, it comes back a little bit to that Gandhi smut story, that you walk in from a position of respect, appreciation, and gratitude, recognizing that the people that you're talking to have to be part of the solution. So let's treat them with the respect that they deserve. So I want to give you a little story that kind of illustrates this. And I've talked about Mark Reynolds. So Mark Reynolds is our executive director, and he used to be in the area of organizational development, by which I mean not fundraising and that sort of thing, but working with large corporations to improve workforce and management style and things like that. And so what Mark would say is, we aren't the angry, yelling people. Politicians are parents and grandparents, and we should be able to find some common ground with them and commonality. So Mark was doing a climate advocate training like this one down at the University of Alabama, and because it was a university, there were 30 students in the room. And they were going to prepare to have a meeting with Jeff Sessions. Now, Jeff Sessions is our current Attorney General, and these 30 students didn't feel off the cuff like they had something that they could appreciate about Jeff Sessions. But Mark wasn't going to let them get away with this. And so in preparing for your meeting with a member of Congress, every time you go in, it's important that you bring in some sort of comment of appreciation for something that your member of Congress has done recently, or said, or sponsored legislation, or co-sponsored legislation, or whatever it might be. And it doesn't have to be about the environment, and it doesn't have to be about climate change. It could be about something else entirely. So in any event, as you prepare for your meeting with other CCL volunteers, the question is going to come up: what are we going to appreciate about this member of Congress? Yes? How many? How many? No, I just need to know how many.
People that, I don't know who you've got, I have 4.
Okay, so
Daniel.
So they'll be coming in, or they're...
They're here. This is the rooster?
Yeah. Okay, can you just get me their names? And so we have 4 other people.
Hold up your hand if you are offering. Yeah, so there's Daniel.
4 here, and then
Greg and myself can do it.
All right, well, so you got
Okay, perfect. So you and Greg as well. Okay, great. 6.
About what time would you like to see?
Just about like 5 after. Yeah. So when you prepare for your meeting, the question is going to be asked, what are we going to appreciate about this member of Congress? So Mark, in leading this session with these 30 students, got to this point and he asked, okay, what do you appreciate and admire about Senator Sessions? And these 30 students looked at him with that kind of look of, surely you jest, sir. So they stared at Mark for about 5 minutes, doing that whole, I'm not going to be the first person to talk thing. And finally, one young woman raised her hand and said, well, we're all science and engineering majors here, and actually Senator Sessions has got a lot of money for our schools. And so here's the tricky part. Mark asked them, Senators, do you genuinely appreciate that? And they said, yeah, we do. And only then did they begin to plan the meeting. So you can find something about your member of Congress that you appreciate, even if it's simply, I appreciate that you continue to stay in Congress during these very difficult times. So that's just something I want you to be aware of, and I hope you won't forget in the pressure cooker of the national conference when you're down there planning your meetings with members of Congress. Always be prepared when you walk in the door for that statement of appreciation and gratitude. We have a structured approach to running our meetings. It depends on a number of roles that we assume will be assigned or that people will take on in the meetings. And they're documented in this meeting outline. So this outline is for an initial meeting with a member of Congress or an influential individual or somebody like that. And so we have a series of roles here. So the first role is leader. So somebody is going to have to be the person who, in the case where people aren't spontaneously signing up, either delegate or be the tiebreaker for decisions. When we schedule meetings in Washington, the national organization will always name a leader, and that leader will be responsible for pulling together any sort of preparation meetings or discussions that have to take place, and then making sure that all of the roles are filled. The second role that's listed there is timekeeper, and timekeeper is also critically important. What the timekeeper is going to do is ask how much time the member of Congress has, and then they are going to interrupt the conversation at whatever point it is, about 5 minutes before the meeting is intended to, 5 minutes before the member of Congress allegedly has to leave the meeting. And always ask the question, you said you had this much time, should we think about wrapping up at this point? Then there's a minutes taker. Yes?
I don't want to interrupt unless it's I do have a question. Okay, Congress people in Massachusetts basically are way beyond this. Is there more in terms of local climate impact? They already know carbon-free dividend. They're already on board with that. If there's a specific question or an item that we want to bring across to them, can we tailor that to the presentation to the congressperson?
Yeah, so the question is, do you tailor this approach based on where you are in the conversation with the member of Congress?
Well, Catherine Clark, Jim McGovern, et cetera, they're all, they get it. So you could be spending your whole time.
Yeah. So again, this outline is for an initial meeting. This outline is not for the 10th meeting or the 12th meeting. By then you presumably have a conversation going, and then you're either going, again, even after a 10th or 12th conversation with an office, you are still not necessarily at the point of comfort where you would want to completely throw this out and take either a more ad hoc approach. It's all going to depend on the pacing of the conversation and how it's been going on over time. So then we have a minutes taker, and again, with the national organization, especially during those meetings with members of Congress in June, and again when we go back in November, we want somebody who's exclusively focused on taking minutes. and not taking minutes on what the CCL members say. We already know what the CCL members are going to say. Capture everything that the aide or the member of Congress is saying and try to get that verbatim as much as possible, suspending judgment, suspending interpretation. Because all of those minutes go to our legislative director, and then he uses them to draw conclusions about the state of the Congress with respect to the climate conversation. Okay, then we move into really the structure of the meeting, which is we do an introduction. I generally recommend everybody goes around the table and says their name and where they're from, and that's it. And no personal stories and no reason why I came down or anything like that, but just to keep the meeting moving. Then the ask. So we always go in with an ask, and this is where, again, if you're on the 12th meeting, the ask could be something very, very specific for that particular office. On the other hand, if you're going in for the first meeting, it could be a very general ask or something that National recommends. Then I think we ask for questions from the staffer or from the member of Congress, and we have a discussion. And then in that period, after we know that we're going to be wrapping up, we have a conversation about what the follow-up will be, what the next steps will be, and then we thank them for their time. So again, I want to say this is where in this meeting, when we get to the conversation, when we get to the questions, and when we get to the conversation about follow-up, is where the practice of the laser talks can be very beneficial. Because if the member of Congress has a question about what's the impact on jobs, what's the impact on energy prices, well, isn't this going to cause all of our manufacturing to flee overseas? You want to have looked and studied and practiced, and I can't say it enough, practice, 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 even if all you do is do it in front of the mirror at home. And get those answers on the tip of your tongue. And that will also happen as in the natural course of things, the more meetings you go through. Because you'll realize what holes you have in your knowledge and where you need to prepare yourself better. And when that, what you want to avoid is a situation where the member of Congress is asking a question, and that's because you don't have the facts at your fingertips or on the tip of your tongue. You're being forced back into any kind of a defensive posture that's going to interfere with, building the relationship and becoming better known to your member of Congress and their staff. I just want to spend 1 second on the ask. So our generic ask is listed here on the sheet at the bottom. And so if it's a Republican, our ask is that you, member of Congress, introduce legislation that puts a fee on fossil fuels and returns the revenue to American households. And we have more to say on that later, but we would like to know what your priorities are for climate, energy, and energy policy. And we're going to come back after the discussion in the follow-up section to reiterate whatever the ask was coming in order to make that part of the follow-up, the consideration of what the follow-up actions will be. But you put it out there at the beginning so that the member of Congress or the staff member knows what you're talking about and why you're there. And then you have the conversation and develop some context and understanding. And then you come back with the ask and say, so how can we follow up on this ask of ours? So that's the structure of the meeting. As the conversation with your member of Congress evolves, you're going to get away from the ask associated, that might be coming from national, and have, again, specific asks for that member of Congress or for the district. And so now, and at the end, at the very end of the meeting, as part of that follow-up discussion, one of the things we always ask is, who do you work well with from across the aisle? Because we are trying to promote this sense of bipartisanship. And so we would like to know, not, what do you think about Democrats, or what do you think about working with Democrats, or vice versa for Republicans. Again, bringing it back to that personal level and saying, who do you personally enjoy working with across the aisle, rather than, do you like working with Democrats, which is too general and not actionable. Does anybody have any questions? Go ahead.
I just have a comment, and my comment relates to the power of where anybody who's new at this, even though we're not in a congressman's office officially, I mean, it's still, you still feel nervous.
Yeah.
And what I experienced was it's so important to have a group of people who care about this issue. And if you're nervous about opening your mouth and saying something, the fact that other people are bringing up thoughts and comments really helps with, empowering other members of the group, individuals.
Great, thank you.
We've gone to two of these meetings already, and it was helpful because when we went in, I was given a role to play, and he said, this was the fellow who was more advanced than I was. He was the liaison, I guess you would call him. And he said, look, if you have any trouble, look at me. And then at that point, he would take over. And it was very helpful.
Great, good advice.
As note taker, I thought in the experience that my group didn't get to hear what notes I took, but it would have been helpful for me in advance to write down a couple of categories of things I needed to make sure to get. Like, for example, concerns, questions, concerns expressed, questions asked, connections offered, and deliverables by our group are some I thought of.
Great.
I think it's also important to write a thank you note following up your visit.
Would you say that this is a facsimile of an actual meeting? I mean, in terms of the interaction and how, I personally found our congressperson pretty receptive and open. I'm not sure that's always the case. I just wondered about that.
That's because I didn't prepare the members of Congress sufficiently. This is actually pretty representative. When I walk around and I listen to the conversations happening in the mock meetings, they sound just like authentic meetings to me. So you've pretty much experienced your first meeting with a member of Congress.
One of the things that happened in our meeting was we occasionally started going down a rabbit hole that wasn't about the purpose of the meeting. And it was really useful to be a group because somebody else would kind of bring us back. And then, of course, I'm the person I'm talking about who was doing that. And it was, and so it was helpful to, oh, that's right, why am I talking about this? So.
Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
He's saying the outline was very useful. It was important. It acted as an important guide, and it's important to stick to the outline as you go through the meeting. But there is also that you are trying to develop a personal relationship, and, well, I will say that sometimes when I've been in these meetings, yes, people do go down rabbit holes, and because there are so many topics to talk about, there are so many agendas that people feel strongly about, and so anytime there's an opportunity to bring that up is something that people want to take advantage of. But again, I come back to that same thing I said before about these are not high-stakes meetings, right? That sometimes meetings do get derailed, but the the promise is that there will always be another opportunity to set things right and to get back on track.
Just a quick question. Is this representative of the amount of time in one of these meetings, or what is representative?
Usually 15 minutes is it could be typical and kind of a minimum. If you're going to meet with a member of Congress, that will be a very brief meeting. It could be 10, it could be 15, it might be 20. It's rare that they say that they have longer than that, although if they're enjoying the conversation, they will take longer than that. With an aide, you'll typically get, it's sort of 20 minutes plus. Maybe it's as much as a half an hour. I had a meeting with an aide that we had met with in June, and we met again in November, and he was very firm about saying that he only had, I think, 10 minutes to meet with us. So I want to get elsewhere.
As a member of Congress, one of the things that impressed me is how the group of people worked together, not talking over one another, but in fact complimenting one another. So that was a really important thing that stood out.
Seems like there are sort of two categories of Congress people we might be talking with. Those who have been there before, who say the organization has gone and has a track record with records from previous meetings and so forth, and the newly elected, newly arrived person. We don't have the foggiest idea where that individual is or coming from. The preparation sounds very, very important in terms of maintaining a relationship with the individual. And I think we didn't really, with the limited time available, to experience that particular element.
Yeah, I'll just mention again that at the conference, there's more time to spend preparing and to talk about what you're going to face when you get into the meeting and who is the member of Congress and where are we in the conversation.
But if you find yourself in the meeting and are surprised that the congressperson says, as I did, yeah, I think I might support the carbon fee program, I was astonished. And I think most of our group probably were as well. What do you do when all of a sudden you have a chance to...
How do you deal with yes?
So I guess the question is, how do you deal with an unexpectedly positive result?
or unexpectedly negative. What do you do when it's a surprise?
Hopefully you sort of have to keep your head, and you have to think, okay, well, now, so if this is the situation, then what is the next question? If it's a surprisingly negative result, if you will, then you need to wonder. Well, I guess the classic response to a negative result is something along the lines of, really, why do you feel that way? Or, oh, really, what have you heard that convinces you of that? And try to, one of the phrases I use over and over again is meet them where they are. Don't try to meet them one or two notches up from, to where you want them to be, but rather, show genuine curiosity about why they hold the position or the opinion that they do.
Going back to this question, do you have a closer? Is there someone we can put them in touch with who'll close the deal with them?
Right, so if it's an unexpectedly positive result, then you say, would you be open to meeting with our legislative director, Danny Richter?
Yes.
And talking about a next step. Okay, maybe one more. This Q&A is the only thing standing between you and lunch. So I'm happy to stay here longer and talk with people, but also if you're starving, then feel free to go have your lunch.
Sometimes representatives will ask for a specific bill, like, I'm supportive of this, but what is the particular bill?
Right. So The answer to that is always, well, there is no bill that's been submitted. And CCL has legislative language, but we are only sharing it with Republicans who are serious about introducing it. We don't want the bill to get out and circulating, because once the language is out, it's just an opportunity for others to demagogue it. So we only share our legislative language with Republicans who are serious about sponsoring, because we want a Republican to lead on the introduction of our bill. Is
the makeup of the bill that is put together now, is the makeup of the bill, does it include
So just hold it closer to you.
does it include the comments that you made earlier about each year it'll be stepped up? Is that part of the bill?
Right, our bill is $15 per ton initial, $10 a ton additional every year thereafter, full revenue return, import, border adjustments, yeah.
I want to know, how typical is it for people to just change their role? Like we, in our little group, everybody got roles, and then anybody did whatever role they felt like.
The most important role is timekeeper, and the second most important role is minutes keeper. And yes, after that, it can be a little bit of a free-for-all. And it all comes down to, I could say, a matter of power versus force. Because what will happen is, you'll have that meeting in the lobby of the hotel where you're preparing for the meeting, and it becomes clear who the leader is, and who's going to lead on what, and not to disparage anybody, who's going to take you down a rabbit hole. Right, so you kind of know that. And then sometimes, yes, if everybody's kind of inexperienced, then it does end up being a little bit of a free fall. But it's not a high stakes event. There will be another one. Okay, thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of the conference.